After the cinematic drought following the release of Return of the Jedi in 1983, the announcement of the prequel trilogy in the late 90s and the resulting hype is something I can't stop watching footage of online, especially with the recent 25th anniversary of The Phantom Menace, mostly since I wasn't born yet in 99, so it's fascinating to see from the outside how excited people were and the weird, pathetic vitriol that ensued for the next decade or so. I personally didn't like The Phantom Menace either when I watched it for the first time as a teenager. It actually bored me to the point of falling asleep when trying to watch it with my father, who also wasn't a fan. And that's just sort of the opinion I've held for all this time, up until rewatching it in theaters with the re-release, where it suddenly clicked into place for me. Maybe my first viewing was ruined by years of hearing other opinions from older Star Wars fans online, or the need to sound like I took movies seriously or something. All that matters is that I finally come around after a decade or so of needless hatred. Which got me thinking about the mountain of tie-in games, which are also considered somewhat low in quality compared to the many other Star Wars games released at the time for the same systems. There's the Rogue Squadron spinoff, the ignored Starfighter game and its sequel, the Xbox exclusive Obi-Wan game, but of course there's the main title based on the movie, simply named The Phantom Menace, developed by Big 8 Productions and released for PC alongside the movie in May of 1999, and for the PlayStation 1 in September of the same year. And after playing this for the first time and completing it, I gotta say that this is a weird game. Most who didn't play it near release would call it a mess or not worth revisiting, which really isn't fair. The fact that Big Ape only had 2 years to develop a game of this scope, while the movie was actively in production with very little material to go off of, is impressive. Watching 2 of the 10 or so developers who worked on this game, that being Mike Ebert and Ray West, speak about the process show that there was more put into The Phantom Menace than just an easy way to keep the lights on. Which is unfortunately how most licensed games and their developers are characterized. It's something I try to challenge on this channel, and especially for games like this. The Phantom Menace was ambitious to say the least, with its lightsaber combat, dialogue trees, fully 3D world, the attempt to port a fairly good-looking PC title to the PlayStation 1 in only a few months. There's a lot to love here, and a lot to, at the very least, get surprisingly upset at.
Thought about killing myself!
Let's steal from Jenny Nicholson and make some compliment sandwiches. I really like the low poly look of the world. It's nowhere near as visually impressive as the PC release, even with this new PS5 remaster that I'm playing it on, but the aliased pixelated look adds its own sort of charm. Same with the kind of ugly pre-renders that just recreate scenes from the movie instead of using the actual scenes, which probably would have taken up more space on the CD. You just gotta love 90s licensed games. I really love how accurate and diverse the different areas feel, especially Naboo, which is chopped up into about 4 different levels. Gungan City feels very cozy in a way. Theed is beautiful, the beige architecture is offset by the bright blue water and greenery, and the palace, while not the most visually interesting, is still very large for a PS1 game. I guess the MacBook disagrees. Tatooine is somehow good to look at when it's just a desert. It's perfectly captured as this vast wasteland filled to the brim with desperate people. It'd just be great if I could, see it. The camera angle in The Phantom Menace is the first thing that makes you realize, oh, this is a quarter of a century old. It's actually fucking abysmal. I know that it was probably done to aid the PC as well as the PlayStation, since the latter clearly struggles to load levels even when emulated on the PlayStation 5. However, this semi-top-down perspective just doesn't really fit the sort of game Big Ape made here, with lots of exploration and platforming. Occasionally, it will go behind the character's back or push in for a dialogue scene, or even go full top-down during a platforming section, but good fucking luck for the rest of the game when that just isn't the case. The platforming in The Phantom Menace is probably my least favorite part of it. It's hard to get excited for this final fight with Maul when I'm constantly retrying the section preceding it because I can't see when I'm jumping properly, and I can only double jump if I press X like a millisecond after I jumped the first time. It's very finicky and sort of aids in padding the runtime more, which is added on top of a game that's already very finicky and buggy. The majority of my time in levels, like most Espo, was spent gaining my bearings since I had no fucking clue where I was, or I was pausing the game to look up that I had missed some doorway that was off to the left that I just couldn't see out of my periphery. The levels are not all bad. The dialogue choices usually do little outside of pushing the story forward, but there's a few levels where it's the main mechanic, like the Gungan City level where you have to free Jar Jar, which can be completed without any combat at all as long as you play it right. That was really neat. Exploring levels and doing side quests that are seemingly meaningless but always find a way to tie into the main story was pretty satisfying. None of these last longer than a few minutes or so, and the few that are separate from the main task usually have some sort of reward, be it information or health. The voice acting here is legitimately great. Every character is voice acted by pretty decent sound-alikes, save for young Anakin, who's actually voiced by Jake Lloyd, and while they do a great job, I just have to give a shout out to those who play aliens on Tatooine, cause some of them just went for it. There is so much life added to this game with those performances, and I'm glad that they were here. Most levels have puzzles, which are pretty straightforward. Find a key, get through a maze, push a crate. None of these felt unfair or like they went on for too long, while also giving a nice reprieve from the constant fighting. For a game with very clunky tank controls, I liked the combat a lot, especially since it's an early iteration of a lightsaber in an action game. As such, it's fairly simple. You just hold square to deflect blaster bolts, and spam the same button to hit droids with your lightsaber. Most enemies go down with 1 or 2 hits, except for bosses, which I'll get to in a second. You can collect all sorts of blasters and detonators, which gives the combat a nice sense of versatility, and prevented it from becoming boring, since you only have the one force ability, which is push, and you never upgrade your lightsaber whatsoever, so I appreciated that there was something there to prevent it from getting old. This nice little rhythm that the game has going sort of falls apart as it continues on. I blame it on the escort missions, which are very obnoxious. Whoever you're protecting will just randomly stop, and due to the camera angle, you'll just lose them if you're not paying attention. And there seems to be some sort of ticking clock once you step too far away from them and they'll just automatically die. This was especially a problem on Theed when escorting Padme's decoy. I nearly set the game down permanently multiple times, and this was the first. The second time I almost did was during one of the few just fucking terrible boss fights. They're almost all pretty unfair and blatantly broken. Especially the fight in Jabba's arena and the random fight at the end of the Coruscant level that I had to do with absolutely 0 health. I may or may not have used a cheat or two to get me through that. Psh, what cheats? We don't use those over here. We're gamers with integrity. There is one boss that works really well for me, and it's unsurprisingly Darth Maul. But it's not the final fight on Naboo, it's the first fight on Tatooine. Complaints aside, I was still enthralled in the Phantom Menace. There were small moments that won me over, like seeing the Republic ship explode from Obi-Wan's perspective, or the lush greenery of the Naboo forest, but the Tatooine section where you play as Qui-Gon was definitively the best portion of the game. Exploring the city and freeing civilians from criminals and obtaining the parts to fix Anakin's pod racer made for a captivating few hours. So when Darth Maul attacks Qui-Gon just like in the movie, even knowing that this was going to be adapted in a 25-year-old game, I still yelled, "Oh shit, Darth Maul." The fight itself was easy, but the emotion was all there. The game had sort of ignored Darth Maul and Sidious for most of the runtime, which I think makes his appearances in the game all the more effective. Although video game Darth Maul has like 3 times the amount of lines that Peter Serafinkowitz has in The Phantom Menace, so that's pretty funny. This whole Tatooine section being the height of the game makes sense considering that it was the one with the most dev time put into it. Big Ape co-founder Mike Ebert said in an interview that Mos Espa was the only scene that they had footage for at the beginning of development, which is what allowed it to become this elaborate and polished portion of the game that's able to seamlessly weave in the exploration, platforming, and dialogue trees. While the final couple levels following Mos Espa aren't worse than the rest of them, they don't quite live up to it, which is hard to process when the 2 things that the Phantom Menace is known for aren't really adapted all that well. The first is the final fight with Maul. Like I said, it's preceded by this mission of Obi-Wan trying to get to the higher platform that both Maul and Qui-Gon are fighting on twice. I do like that it alternates with Padme storming the palace just like the movie, and cutting both Anakin and Jar Jar from the final fight feels like a smart choice to make. However, it just seems like a weird time to further pad out the game's length. And oddly enough, the game uses Duel of the Fates at every other point except for the final fight with Darth Maul. Even the earlier fight on Naboo uses that track. What the fuck, man? The second thing not properly adapted is the pod racing scene, which couldn't be showed in the game since LucasArts was making Episode 1 Racer. So you just don't see the pod racers at all. Instead, you watch reaction shots from the main characters as the announcers speak over the intercom. And as disappointing as this must have been in 1999, it's sort of cute now. There's a lot of these design choices that were clearly made since the team had no time, like Boss Nass is missing from the final cutscene, there's only one Viceroy and he thankfully doesn't have an offensive accent this time, or since the majority of the screen time in the movie between Coruscant until Naboo is just talking, the game just adds another text crawl, and I sort of love it. That's kind of how the majority of the Phantom Menace feels. Whenever it's doing something unique or interesting or sort of quaint, I'm having a fun time. Until I remember that it's a game that I actually have to play. Had I played the original PS1 title, I wouldn't have enjoyed myself nearly as much as I did. Modern additions like save states and rewinds ironically saved the game from itself. As much work and love that was put into it, this is a game where the seams are very visible and it almost feels like it'll just explode randomly, but I did still manage to have fun exploring the worlds and finding secrets. It's very easy to write a game like The Phantom Menace off as a train wreck or a hilarious failure, which doesn't seem fair at all. Big Ape clearly put a lot of work into this, especially for only having a 2-year dev cycle, and I personally like it a lot more than the team's later work on games like Simpsons Wrestling, which also had a lot of behind-the-scenes struggles and presumably Celebrity Deathmatch, but I refuse to find that out for myself, and the same thing goes for the film The Phantom Menace. It's easy to play into the narrative that George Lucas is a hack, or the film was solely made for merchandise. It's a cynical viewpoint that looks for an easy answer rather than the truth, which is often complicated. Art has flaws that can often be off-putting to many. The imperfections and slip-ups can be seen as the reason why something is terrible, or the exact part of what makes it charming in the first place. And in that way, I think the Phantom Menace game is a perfect adaptation of the movie. Don't forget to share this on Ain't It Cool News?
Battle against an overwhelming droid fighter assault.
Trouble, just hang on!
Naboo is getting pounded. You managed to take one down. Only 2,000 more to go. You haven't experienced Star Wars until you've flown the electronic Naboo fighter. Droid fighters sold separately, batteries not included.